place and over to another. You can cross a river to get to the other side, immigrating, going from one country to another by crossing the borders. It could also mean something a little bit more abstract, changing your mind from believing one thing to believing another thing. Maybe a change in your moral values or your beliefs. So it's an invisible or an abstract boundary. So there are many different kinds of boundaries and borders. I have actually got some definitions of boundary and border. So from vocab.com, a boundary is a border and it can be physical, such as a fence between two properties, or abstract, such as a moral boundary that society decides it is wrong to cross. Or from Encyclopedia Britannica, a boundary is something such as a river, a fence, or an imaginary line that shows where an area ends and another area begins, or a point or limit that indicates where two things become different, or unofficial rules or official about what should not be done, limits that define acceptable behavior. I also thought about other abstract boundaries, like, people have their personal space, don't they? And so you as a person, you have your beliefs and your values, and you have this personal space where you don't mind sort of kissing and hugging your close relatives and families, but you wouldn't expect that from somebody that perhaps you don't know very well. You would feel very uncomfortable if a stranger or someone that you didn't know just came and gave you a big kiss and a big hug, and it would just feel really wrong to you. So that's invading your personal space. Other boundaries, borders, I was thinking about with alcoholics. I know we as a church and believers, we don't drink alcohol, but sadly the world, they do. And so there's an acceptable limit of alcohol, and there's an unacceptable limit. But there's a lot of research about alcoholism, and it talks about this invisible line that each and every person has, and that everybody's ability to when you drink alcohol, it affects people in different ways, and everyone has this invisible line. So one glass of wine affects a person in a certain way, it'll affect another person in a completely different way. So everybody's different, and everyone has this invisible line. And alcoholism is basically when you become dependent on alcohol like drugs, and you can't get through the day without having an alcoholic drink. Okay, so you become completely dependent. You're in bondage by this toxin. And the point I was trying to make about the invisible line is you can't see the line, and the danger is, you drink alcohol, and this line gets closer and closer to you until you get to a point where you actually cross the line. And once you cross the line, there's no going back. You can't go back. You become dependent on this alcohol. So basically, I was just thinking of borders and boundaries, and I did go off on a little bit of a tangent, because then I started looking at all the different boundaries and borders all over the world, and there's some really, really interesting information out there on the internet. The longest boundary in the world is the USA, Canadian border boundary, and in actual fact, I'll tell you how long it is. and it's got this, what's really interesting, it's got this big gap between, so it's got Canada, and then it's got like a whole sort of patch of no trees, and then it's got the USA. So the longest international border is the United States-Canadian border and is 5,525 miles long. The entire length of the border has a strips of deforested land measuring 20 feet across. So it's like quite interesting. And the highest border is the international border between China and Nepal. It crosses the precise summit point of Mount Everest, which peaks at 8,848 meters. So very high. Unfortunately, I've got pictures, but my laptop died during the week, so I can show you afterwards if you want to have a look. But this, all of this about boundaries and borders is just forming a little bit of a context of what I really wanted to talk to you about. So going back to Abraham, Abraham had to go through a change. He had to make a choice. You know, God spoke to him, and you know, he had to listen and obey. Well, he didn't have to. Like I said, he had a choice. So he could have chosen to stay, but he went. Okay, and bear with. Even Jesus had boundaries. In Luke chapter 5, verse 15 to 16, but so much the more went there fame abroad of him, and great multitudes came together to hear and to be healed by him of their infirmities. And verse 16, and he withdrew himself into the wilderness and prayed. God has a lot to say about boundaries. There are many verses in the Bible about boundaries. God's boundaries keep us in his will and help us with direction and purpose. Keep us on his path. He is the way, the life, and the truth. And God's boundaries keep us walking his way, living our lives the way he intended for us to live, in his truths, because he loves us and has provided for us in every conceivable way. God's laws are God-given. God made boundaries, showing us how to live, and without them there is only chaos, confusion, destruction, and death. So Abraham crossed over into Canaan, where he was led and blessed by God. The people worshipped God and were a holy nation. However, the Israelites, they did not remain in Canaan. They ended up in Egypt eventually for about 430 years. So they crossed over again. Again, they crossed over into Egypt, and Egypt was a land where other gods were worshipped. Sadly, after a long time, the Israelites, they were probably quite influenced by the culture and the social environment of the Egyptian way of life. The Egyptians that did not worship God. But to fast forward a little bit, Moses did lead them out of Egypt, and then Joshua actually led the Israelites back into the land of Canaan after Moses had died. But basically, century after century, the Israelites, they just kept going back to this worship of false gods. They kept turning back to the idolatry and to the gods of Egypt, worshipping idols and graven images and the gods their fathers worshipped on the other side of the river. In fact, God eventually allowed them to be recaptured, and they were taken back across the Euphrates River, back to Babylon, back into exile. I guess perhaps, well, they wanted their false gods, they wanted their, to worship their false gods. So, well, that's what they got. They went back into exile, and they were. God gave them over into the hands of their enemies, and now they were back in the foreign land again. During this exile, some were faithful to God. Daniel, although in a foreign land, he refused to compromise on his beliefs. He continued to worship God, the true living God. Didn't God warn us about what would happen when there's a little bit of yeast? It affects the whole batch.